Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. I'm Becca Economopoulos, Executive Director of the Natural History Museum, and thank you for joining us for the Data Center Frontier. This is the first event of a new programming series. That song that you heard at the top was Which Side Are You On? A labor anthem written in 1931 during the Harlan County coal mine strikes, with additional lyrics written and performed by the Sun Sing Collective, which is a group of musicians in Virginia who use music to inspire resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure. This question, which side are you on, has animated labor struggles, land struggles, and anti-colonial struggles for nearly a decade. And it's the question that grounds our new series, Natural History from the Other Side. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to briefly situate the series that it's a part of. Natural history from the other side begins from the understanding that natural history is not neutral observation. It's a site of struggle over meaning and power that shapes how we understand the world and how the world itself is ordered. Natural history and its institutions have long been entangled with imperialist world building. The museums and science expeditions of the 19th and early 20th centuries rendered communities, creatures, large and small, and the land itself as objects of study in service of classification, extraction, and control. And it didn't end there. This series takes up that history in the present. It asks what it means to see today's infrastructures, AI data centers, border checkpoints, ICE detention facilities, not as neutral or inevitable, but as part of the same ongoing project, built to capture, to categorize, and contain, rendering life, land, and knowledge into resources to be extracted or threats to be managed. The series shifts that vantage point, looking from the other side of that history, from the standpoint of those confronting these systems, refusing them, and building alternatives in the face of them. So not just diagnosing systems of power, but identifying the forms of life, resistance, and world-making that exceed them. This series is shaped by our 2026-2028 cohort of Red Natural History Fellows, an interdisciplinary group of scholars and organizers whose movement-engaged research and activism spans agrarian reform and food justice, indigenous land defense, energy systems, and political ecology. And their work really grounds this series in both historical analysis and present-day struggles. So today's conversation was curated by Red Natural History Fellow Jordan B. Kinder, called The Data Center Frontiers. It takes up one of the fastest growing and most consequential infrastructures of our time. We're living through a massive build-out of data centers driven by AI, cloud computing, and speculative tech investment. And while these systems are often framed as immaterial, as the cloud, they are anything but. They are profoundly material. They require vast quantities of energy and water. They depend on mineral extraction, new pipelines, power plants, and increasingly new forms of land appropriation and enclosure. Communities impacted by this build-out contend with noise and light pollution, water depletion, rising energy costs, and the consolidation of land and resources in the hands of a small number of tech billionaires, all in the name of a technological future that is being sold as inevitable. But what's equally striking is the movement taking shape in response. In community after community, people are organizing to stop these projects and assert community control. And often that begins as a local fight, but increasingly, communities are connecting across geographies and across differences, including party lines, to build durable solidarities against a rapidly expanding digital industrial regime. So what can we learn from these fights, from recent victories at the local level, and from the long history of Indigenous-led resistance to extractive infrastructure? These are the questions our speakers are going to tackle today, and so much more. Please join me in welcoming Jordan B. Kinder, Red Natural History Fellow and author of Petroturfing, Refining Canadian Oil Through Social Media; Crystal Tubols, Executive Director of Honor the Earth, organizing at the intersection of Indigenous sovereignty, anti-militarism, and environmental justice; Thea Riofrancos, scholar and author of Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism, just came out last year, whose work examines the material politics of the energy transition; and Vivek Barathan, technologist and organizer with the No Desert Data Center Coalition in Arizona and a data center fellow with Media Justice. Before we dive in, we'd love to hear from you in the chat. I see many of you have been introducing yourselves. So yeah, please share your name, where you're joining from, your affiliation or field, if you'd like to share. And let us know what brought you to this event and what you'd like to get out of it. And a few quick housekeeping logistics. You will find at the bottom of your screen a Q&A box. You can drop your questions there at any point. And also, this event is being recorded and it will be shared on our website and emailed to everyone who registered. Finally, I want to thank our sponsors, the Henry Luce Foundation and For Culture. Thank you for supporting this work. With that, I will turn things over to our Director of Research, Steve Lyons, who will be moderating today's roundtable conversation. Steve, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Becca, for getting us started. And I am not going to take up any more space at this moment. What I will say is this is going to be a roundtable format. We're going to start out with a question for each of our amazing panelists that we're very lucky to have here today. And then we'll open it up in a more loose, informal way so that people can engage with each other around all the many important issues that we're here to talk about around what we're calling the data center frontier and its relationship to other frontiers of struggle that people in this room and in history have been struggling against for centuries. With that, I'd like to start with you, Jordan, who curated this event and brought this idea of the data center frontier to the Natural History Museum's work. So I'm wondering if we can start by just giving us the lay of the land. So what are these AI data centers? Why do they seem to be popping up like crazy? And as someone who has a background in studying fossil fuel infrastructure in Canada, do you see what we're calling the data center frontier as part of this energy frontier that's been at the center of environmental organizing for the past several decades, or as something new and distinctive, or in a sense, something in between? With that, get us started, Jordan. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for showing up. I would say then somewhere in between is the short answer, but the long answer is that, as I think many of us are familiar with the sort of hard sell or buzz around AI itself, of which data centers can be considered the infrastructural substrata, is sold to us in terms of novelty and newness. But that's not really the reason why they captured my attention and inspired me to organize this event. What's caught my attention is more about historicizing them in terms of what's older, contiguous with older infrastructures, so we don't fall for or confirm that buzz around newness. So as you told everyone, Steve, I'm a scholar of media and communication studies, mostly working on energy, media, infrastructure, and environment, with attention to oil and gas pipelines and the cultural imaginaries around them. with a primary focus, and this sort of matters, I think, for a conversation later, with a primary focus on Canadian or Albertan oil sands. So really, I've spent a lot of time studying proposals, contestations, and constructions of oil and gas pipelines. So one of my propositions is that I think we can understand data centers as an energy infrastructure in themselves, which I can also speak more about later in our discussion. But in that, they in many ways resemble pipelines, and that's what has drawn my attention to them. They significantly impact the environment. They require land and resources at a relatively large scale for both construction and operation. They're speculative, as we heard earlier, in the sense that not everyone necessarily gets approved and built, but even if it's just a small portion that do, this is still a kind of win for that sedimentation of infrastructure. And another important point is that they're capital rather than labor intensive. What that means is when operational, they don't exactly provide that many permanent jobs, although the construction does create a temporary boom, and that's really where a lot of the kind of employment draw comes from. Because of these sort of material and what we can consider to be political economic similarities, I'm seeing similar modes, or at least prospects of resistance, in what I can consider to be like the early days of the data center build out still. And that's similarities with sort of resistance to pipeline infrastructure in particular. The most promising to me, at least, seems to be around coalition building, which I think we'll talk also a lot about today, amongst Indigenous land defenders, farmers, community members, who simply don't really see the costs of hosting these centers on their lands or in their communities as outweighing the benefits. For me, a parallel can be drawn to organizing around the Keystone XL pipeline project. So that's the old, but what I'd like to say is new in the fight, I think, can be explained by what's different about a data center when you compare it to a pipeline. They're more distributed as nodes rather than as lines. And so more communities can arguably be affected by them. And I think we're seeing that in the kind of mass amount of proposed data centers on the horizon. So in the US, so a statistic worth noting is at the end of 2025, there are almost 3,000 in construction or planned on top of an already existing over 4,000. Whereas pipelines attempt also to be invisible and are often underground, data centers aren't. They're more like oil and gas refineries in this way, in their relationship to landscape and visibility and impact. Another difference that is a novelty of sorts is I think it's much more difficult to convince us and everyone that we need a data center than it is to convince people that we need oil. So even environmentalists who are against oil, so to speak, they recognize that oil and fossil fuels structure our everyday life for better or worse. In fact, that's one of the organizing points around questions of energy transition. I don't think the same can be said about data, particularly when we're seeing kind of immediate effects from data centers, like utility cost increases, energy bills are higher, water bills are higher, and even computer components like RAM. So along with that kind of question about land and resources, there's also a question about what in media studies we'll call it content, what it is that the data actually is. We can question what the data are and who they serve. So in the AI question, I think we can, or at least I would argue that AI ultimately seeks to make intellectual capacity a utility or resource. And I think people are questioning for whom and what data centers are being built in these 2 or 3 registers, which is why we're seeing such a momentum around opposition and a kind of coalition in those ways.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for getting us started there. I'd like to turn it to Crystal, who is representing Honor the Earth. And Honor the Earth is doing some amazing work, both in researching and in building a grassroots resistance to the siting of new data centers on or near native reservations in the United States. Let's say. Can you tell us about the No Data Centers on Native Land campaign? Introduce us to the project. Why did you need to start this campaign? And what are you seeing in this work?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And thank you for that. Yeah, just laying the groundwork, Jordan. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so we picked up this fight maybe about a year ago when my community was actually approached. I live about 15 miles off the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Basically, a nuclear feasibility study was done. And of course, there was absolutely no deterrence for having a small modular reactor built in this community. It's a coal community. We already have extraction here, things like that. But after some research, we quickly discovered that the reason for a small modular reactor was directly connected to hyperscale data centers that were being proposed in the state of Montana. We started out with 3, one of which is proposed for 5,000 acres, which would be the largest in the United States to date if it were to go through. And so obviously they need that large amount of energy, electricity to power it, hence the nuclear, right? But I think the more we dove into this, the more that we've seen that this is like what they are proposing is the whole infrastructure for AI. And so we started to quickly connect all of the dots, right? So we've seen that there's this push for generative AI. In order for that to happen, you have to have the hyperscale data centers physically, right? Where are they going to build those? Most likely on native indigenous lands, as we've seen from history. History tells us, right? But then we're also seeing that those hyperscale data centers need energy, extreme amounts of energy, right? So now you're looking at the expansion and the fast tracking of nuclear, getting nuclear power plants on track, are operational soon. You're also looking at saving the coal industry, right? We see executive orders doing that. We see the expansion of fracking, frack gas to utilize until nuclear is online. And then also you're looking at critical minerals mining, right? You need critical minerals for the GPUs, for the servers, for the air conditioners, everything. But also now uranium is declared a critical mineral. And so you're also going to need uranium mining for nuclear power. And so for us, that entire infrastructure that exists, right, to really power generative AI, majority of those are already targeting native lands, right? And we've already been experiencing that. We're already seeing nuclear approaching Indian country. We're already seeing hyperscale data center corporations approaching Indian country, even going as far as educating native-owned energy companies to approach our own people to be able to sell these, right? And so we're seeing all of that happen. And then we're also connecting the dots to surveillance, right? The mass surveillance of citizens, and then also the impacts internationally for folks who are actually witnessing and observing and going through and verifying data through AI that is being obtained through AI in other countries like Ethiopia, and the trauma that comes and impacts those peoples as well, right? So this is much larger. And so for us, we're really approaching it and have named it the death cycle of AI. But really what we're talking about is the infrastructure for generative AI, right? And so what we're seeing now is the targeting of Indian countries, specifically because we have large land bases. We have access to water. There's tax incentives both in the states and locally, right? You're also looking at a lack of legal infrastructure. Oftentimes our communities, especially those that don't have access to monetary resources, don't have the legal infrastructure to hold these corporations accountable, or even to put guidelines and protections in place prior to, right? You're also looking at extreme poverty, right? The possibility of having all of these jobs, even if for a short amount of time during the construction phase, is very appealing to communities that live in extreme poverty, right? By design. Then you add in the jurisdictional issues, right? You're just looking at the lack of being able to hold these corporations accountable. So you add all of those things together. And so what happened shortly after we discovered here in my own community that there was data centers proposed nearby, a small modular reactors, that we started seeing all of these data center proposals pop up across Indian country. We started to talk to tribal leaders. We started to attend meetings. We attended National Congress of American Indians, who's pushing to normalize the use of AI. And so we just started to connect all of the dots. And that really showed us that there was a need for us to really come together. And I think also just looking at like the previous fight with critical minerals is like, oftentimes Indian country gets left out of the narrative, even within movement spaces. And so for us, even within this fight against data centers, which has reached broad scales across the country, we're also seeing the absence of Native voices within those spaces. And so we at Honor the Earth really wanted to pull together a coalition and make sure that we were actually like holding these corporations accountable, but also bringing our voices together to be able to be at the table and fight back with more power. And so the coalitions that were mentioned above, we've built out 4 coalitions so far. And so I'll end with just saying we have the National Coalition, No Data Colonialism. I think we have 39 different Native nations represented within that coalition. And then we have one specifically in Montana. That's a coalition of ranchers, agriculture folks, coal miners, and Native folks here. And then we have the similar one in South Dakota and a similar one in Oklahoma as well. And so coalitions has been the bread and butter and what's been able to give us the leverage and enough power to really push back. And we've had a few victories already. We've been able to actually push some of the largest tribal nations in the country to pass moratoriums, to pass all-out bans, and to also issue task force and to issue feasibility and impact studies as well before they try to move forward. So we've had some victories through these coalitions, but I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. That's super inspiring work. So we can see now that while data centers are these nodes spreading all across the country, so too are these resistance movements that are getting bound together and held together through this coalition work. And I want to turn to Vivek actually to talk about another coalition that's been doing really incredible work. Vivek represents the No Desert Data Center Coalition that has built a formidable opposition to Amazon's Project Blue, which is a massive new data center project in Tucson, Arizona, that has not yet been built. Vivek, could you tell us what Project Blue is, why it's a problem for Tucson, and what it took to create such a powerful movement against it? What narratives help bring people together to support this resistance? And also, as it's evolving, the situation, it would be great to hear what the current status of Project Blue is today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I'm, as someone who's new to this level of community organizing, I'm so honored and humbled to be here. Crystal, your work and Honor the Earth's work has been really inspirational to ours. It's a real pleasure to share this space with you all. So our story here in Southern Arizona starts in June, when the Pima County Board of Supervisors was considering a vote to sell about 290 acres of land. That's living desert land, some of the tallest choyas and ocotillos I've ever seen in my life, to an extractive developer called Beal Industries to build a hyperscale data center here. We heard about it a few days before the vote in a news report, and we went out there to the Board of Supervisors meeting. About 30 of us mobilized to go. And what we found when we got there was that the county administration, which is the bureaucratic administrative side of our county government, had set up the process so only proponents of the project had a chance to speak at length, give a crappy PowerPoint presentation, and take questions from the Board of Supervisors. And that went on for a few hours during the middle of a workday, right? So even though we showed up in numbers, a bunch of people had to leave and go back to work. And when it was our turn to speak, we only got 2 minutes each to make our case. So the Board of Supervisors had their minds made up already because of how the process had been set up. We learned during that meeting that because the data center needed a tremendous amount of water, millions of gallons of water to cool the facility, and because Tucson Water is a public utility, that the city of Tucson would have to vote. And we knew they would vote about 7 weeks later. So that's how much time we had to mobilize our community and get this done. So we came together again. We met in person, decided that this was a campaign. And we were able to really mobilize on 3 big messages. One was water use, right? Water is a scarce resource, and everyone here knows that. Rising energy costs. We knew that wherever they put these hyperscale data centers, including from our neighbors in Phoenix, that consumers end up subsidizing the costs of these data centers through rising energy bills. And our Arizona Corporation Commission, which is the regulatory body that's supposed to protect ratepayers, is always happy to give corporations whatever they ask for. And lastly, it was NDAs. The county signed secret NDAs with these companies that hid the end user from the public. So we were able to mobilize along these messages, reach out to our city council, and even though the county has remained in favor of the project, our city council members and the mayor were very responsive and ended up voting unanimously to reject the proposal, which was fantastic news for us. That's how many people heard about this project. It was really a momentous win that we've heard has inspired other communities to fight. And we want to make it clear that this is not a NIMBY movement, right? This is not an anyone's backyard movement because of the reasons Crystal already named, because we understand these data centers as facilitating the greatest transfer in wealth, distribution of wealth in recent human history, all in service of the cruelty industry, right? Surveillance, genocide. Had that win, unfortunately, our electricity provider here, Tucson Electric Power, is a private utility. And because it's a private utility, our local governments don't have any jurisdiction about deals that private companies make with each other. So the private utility cut the water cooling out of it and made this an air-cooled facility, with the developer, and they came back with a new proposal that went straight to the state. The state has approved it. We were suing. Sorry. We had a lawsuit against the county that was dismissed last week. We will be appealing, but they have started clearing the land. Yesterday, I went out and saw it, and it's really hard to take because it's just new news this week. Like you all said, it's not over yet, but they are starting to clear the land, and we're still hoping to stop it. And that's where things are today.
Thank you, Vivek. And what your community is going through is something that people across the country and across the world, in fact, are going through right now. And this opposition, this resistance is aggregative in its power. You're inspiring people across the world, in fact, to push back against these projects that seem inevitable and the structures that make these projects inevitable. I just want to say that everyone here appreciates the work that you and the No Desert Data Coalition is doing, and the fight isn't over till the fight is over. And we'll speak more about that in this conversation. I want to turn now to Thea to give us, in a sense, to zoom out, actually. I mentioned already the water guzzling aspects of these major projects. That is one of the obvious ways in which the data center frontier is tied to a longer history of extraction, right? And an extractive relationship to the land and what people call, or what industry calls, its resources, right? So we know about water guzzling, we know about the mining that's necessary for their build-outs and the energy used to power them. But there are also some less obvious ways in which the data center frontier is articulated with or connected to this longer history and infrastructure of extraction. And so we don't need to get into the precise supply chains that make up these servers, which are going to change all the time, I'm sure. But what might we gain by thinking about the relationship between these new infrastructures and the many industries and extractive processes that go into them?
Thanks so much, Steve. And I just want to share my solidarity for Vivek and for Crystal and all of the amazing frontline work that they're doing. And I will do my best in this first intervention of mine to circle back on some of the similarities between frontline resistance to mining and frontline resistance to data centers, and maybe some hopeful words about how those struggles can really evolve from setbacks to victories. And so I'll try to circle back to that in a moment. But just to take your cue to zoom out globally and historically, we live in a world that has been made by over 500 years of colonialism, racial capitalism, and extractivism. And it's been made that way in a mode that benefits the privileged few, primarily in former imperial states, but also globally, the global affluent are the ones that are benefiting from their investments in these data centers, their investments in mining companies, and writ large, the kind of profiteering across these sectors. And so these are very old structures of extractivism. That's what makes them so durable. They are also very unequal in their financial benefits versus their ecological and social harm, which also sets them up as a power relation that has been contested, can be contested, and will continue to be contested. I think one of the hardest things to keep in our heads, because it's a contradiction about extractivism, is it's one of the most durable architectures of our material kind of global economy on the one hand, and it is also the aspect of our economy that is most prone to amazing David and Goliath battles and asymmetric conflicts that can actually mean that communities win, that global South societies win, that people that are or have been colonized can actually undo that and dismantle that. And so we have to keep the durability of the power in check with like how much that fact has agitated and mobilized communities around the world to contest this extractivism. So I want to hold both that criticism and then that kind of critique and then that hope at the same time. To step back even maybe in a different direction, not across history, but across these supply chains, I think it really can't be overstated the degree of extractive pressure that our planet and our communities and our landscapes and our livelihoods and our culturally meaningful spaces are being subjected to at this moment. we are living in a moment of massive expansion of the fossil fuel industry. We are not exactly in an energy transition. There might be here or there on Earth that is really transitioning. At a global scale, we're an energy addition. What that means is that we have a simultaneity of oil, gas, and coal build out of all of the downstream and knock-on harms that come from that in terms of the climate crisis, as well as the localized pollution and contamination and violence that they cause, alongside build out for renewable energy supply chains, which is what I focus on, that require a lot of mining, not mining of fossil fuels per se, but mining of other minerals like lithium and copper and rare earth minerals and cobalt and nickel and all of these things for the supply chains that furnish the inputs for solar panels, transmission lines, electric vehicles, wind turbines, etc. And I think, so we have all these extractive pressures at once. And then what's concerning, and I'm so glad Crystal brought up critical minerals a few times, because that's what I'm going to speak to. So we have a little background already. What's concerning is that these critical minerals have many different end uses. Let's take lithium. With lithium, we can power an electric bus. That might be something that communities want to get behind and think about as a form of mobility justice and clean mobility. But with that same lithium, we can power an electric Hummer, which is basically a product created for the affluent that is not going to solve the climate crisis and is actually requires way more raw materials than that electric bus does per person. With that same lithium, we can create a battery that is for energy storage on a community solar grid. That could be great for energy justice, but we can also create a battery that goes into a data center owned by OpenAI, Anthropic, whatever it is, right? So that same technology has these different uses. And speaking in a moment of illegal and horrifying war, we also have to understand that lithium batteries play a major role in military hardware, from drones to any of the kind of off-site or off-grid technologies that need batteries to operate in order to kill people and dominate landscapes. And so we're just seeing that these technologies of militarism, of big tech, and of the energy transition are increasingly intermeshed in their supply chains, which is providing more and more impetus for policymakers to say, we need these critical minerals no matter what, whether for geopolitics or for energy transition or this digital transition. And that's subjecting, again, the same marginalized communities, whether it's in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, but also within the United States, Canada, settler colonies, right? These communities that are affected in the US look very similar in terms of having indigenous identity, indigenous territory, indigenous rights that are not respected by the governments, in terms of being racialized communities, impoverished and neglected communities. There is a lot in common across these front lines, but what we see is that wherever we go, similar types of communities are subjected to these harms, and they are not the ones that primarily benefit from any of this build out. Maybe just a couple last things to say here, and I want to circle back to that piece on resistance to extraction. And again, Vivek, I feel honored that you shared this vulnerability with us and been here with us in this really hard moment of this campaign, but maybe to just offer a view of how this could unfold in the future. In Latin America, there are so many mining projects that we can call stranded assets. That's just like an economics 101 term for whenever a company invests in something, maybe does some initial ground clearing or exploration or whatever, but then the community resistance and the coalition behind that, the broad coalition, is so strong that investors get scared off and projects stall. And so we can really think about the fact that opposition to mining at the front lines shares a lot of similarities with opposition to data centers. We're talking about physical assets in specific sites harming racialized and indigenous communities, but also happening in places where the community fight back is increasingly strong. And corporations feel pressured to offer these kind of fake forms of community social responsibility or jobs or this or that. That's because of our pressure. That reveals a vulnerability. And what I've learned from mining is that there are often many rounds to these conflicts. There are provisional victories on the kind of fight back side. There are provisional defeats, and that these are long-term projects with huge sunk costs and with physical specificities, and they can be disrupted and stalled, rerouted and renegotiated throughout their whole life cycles, including all the way to the piece about waste and what happens with the remediation, which is a whole other social justice battle that we have to do over any physical infrastructure in our built environment. I will leave it there, but I'm happy to chat more also about the war and supply chains and geopolitics and how that is also roiling all of these issues as well.
Thank you so much, Thea, for that lay of the land. You just brought up the kind of this one of the spatial aspects to the resistance to these centers is a resistance movement against mining makes the minerals more costly for the data center buildouts. And so these things do add up and articulate. The resistance adds up and articulates. Once things become so prohibitively difficult and costly, you will see these stranded assets beginning to come about. But I want to think about the historical as well as the spatial articulation between struggles. And so when we began planning for this event, we felt it was important that we don't only delve into the problem that we're up against, but also the lessons we can derive from our movement elders and our ancestors, those whose legacies we're building on in the work we're doing today. Because for us, it's important to always insist that whatever form the problem takes, we're never starting from scratch. When we lose a battle, we're not losing the war. So to get more to the open part of this, and I'm inviting everyone to come join in the conversation and to ask questions of each other, and we can make it more organic. I wonder if we might want to directly address this. So what should people organizing against AI data centers today learn from, for example, the long history of indigenous resistance to pipelines, which, as Jordan laid out, does offer some real tools and practical tools, but also in terms of the kinds of values that ground these movements. So I wonder if, Crystal, you could take us off with that, because you have a lot of personal experience in such fights. So I wonder if you could jump in and tell us a little bit about how the work you're doing or the work other people doing to resist data centers on native lands right now are building on learning from the lessons and the struggles that preceded this new-ish frontier.
Yeah, I can name a few. And honestly, I'm sitting here wrapping my mind around it. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from pipeline resistance in general for life. But I think the biggest ones is like the effectiveness of like coalitions, right? And we've already all named that. We all are engaged in these coalitions in one way or another. And I think that's where you've seen the power of Standing Rock, right? Is like you had that, or even the Keystone Pipeline, the first iteration was, there's a whole book written called Unlikely Alliances around pipeline fights, right? That were communities coming together. And so I think coalitions is definitely one of those things. I think also we have to be able to move through micro, like local grassroots organizing all the way up to like state level, municipality, federal, and then international. I think we always have to be able to move. And I think that's a muscle that the entire movement needs to learn how to exercise a little bit more. I think like we all tend to have like our expertise areas, right? Either you're really good at grassroots organizing, local organizing, things like that, or you're doing national organizing, or you're doing more of the geopolitical work on the international front. But I think like what we've learned at Honor the Earth and through all of my organizers we've been organizing our entire lives. We're all grassroots organizers. I wasn't trained into my position. I just seen a need in my community and I stepped forward. And that's how most of my staff is. But I think through all of our experience, what we're now implementing at Honor the Earth and what we're seeing as effective is like our ability to move from grassroots organizing all the way to international organizing. And in fact, that's what you'll see from Honor the Earth in the near future is you're going to see us move more into the federal and international playing field with the data center campaign that we have already on the local level. And I think that's what we need to do. And like that was the effectiveness that you've seen at Dakota Access Pipeline, at Standing Rock, was the fact that the fight went from treaty struggles, treaty land, protecting the water, all the way to being an international fight about protecting water globally and indigenous rights globally. And so I think that's the big thing. I think we have to be able to move across topics. And I think that's something that we see with pipeline fights as well, is like a pipeline fight is not just a pipeline fight, right? There's so much more to this. I think the other thing too is really looking at like the infrastructure itself, which is why I switched gears talking about AI infrastructure versus just the hyperscale data center and the physical impact, is because these are infrastructures, these are systems that are in place, right? Looking back at the history of the United States, you're looking at settler colonialism, right? Doctrine of discovery. There were no Christians here. This land was claimed on behalf of a kingdom, queendom, the sovereign. And so they insert settler colonialism, like an especially violent type of colonialism, right? And then from there, you see militarism. the US military being formed around indigenous resistance, very specifically, right? And then boom, you got the US military, US Army. And then from that point, you see the US military going to other countries, other indigenous peoples' lands, invading in the name of mutual aid or protecting women's rights or democracy, quote unquote. And so you see that happening, and that's where you get like US imperialism, right? And so it is a very simplified way of looking at that. But in general, that's the trajectory, that's our history, right, of the US. But this country was founded on settler colonialism, white supremacy, right? And so I think until we address that, we're going to continue to see these outcomes that we're seeing. We're going to continue to fight these same fights over and over again, insert different name, pipeline, insert critical minerals mining, insert data centers, insert anything that's going to be coming in the future as well. It is all part of the same structure, and we're always going to be fighting these same things until we actually go to the root of what is allowing this to happen, right? And then you think about who's making the decisions for us to engage in US imperialism and to be an empire, right? That's our leadership. Who is paying for them? That's corporations are backing these, our representatives that are supposed to represent the people, right? But they're not. They're actually representing corporations. And so really, are we a democracy? Are we more of a corporatocracy, right? And I question that. And anytime we talk about democracy, I actually have no belief in that whatsoever unless they're talking to the Haudenosaunee people. And so to me, like that's the big thing, is that's one of the world's oldest democracies. And so I think that's the start point, right? Is like we have to question the system that we actually live in, and we have to go back to the root causes of these, and we have to address the structural and the systematic issues first. Otherwise, we're going to continue to fight symptoms, which to me is what the extraction industry is. It's a symptom of something larger, right? Of the foundations of this country. And so for me, that's the lessons that need to be learned from Indigenous peoples who have been fighting these fights since before pipelines were a thing, right?
You can all jump in.
I'll say a couple of words. That was really excellent, Crystal. Thank you so much. In terms of, maybe I'll just speak a little broader to what I've learned from struggles against extractivism, not just pipelines, if that's okay. I've worked on pipelines, but more on mining. And I co-sign everything that Crystal just said. And maybe to add, I think that on the one hand, the power of a community or a coalition to resist a place-based project comes from a couple of factors. One is like, how organized are you already? Meaning what we see in so many of these struggles, and I think Crystal's so on point that like these are just phases of history that the same communities go through, the same landscapes are subjected to. And so it's not about the mining company shows up and what do? It's like, where were you already in terms of your community organization, your internal forms of decision-making and leadership, your level of social trust within the community, and all of that, right? Because when the mining company shows up and you are already organized, whatever your last struggle was or whatever your identity basis is, but you're an already organized community, the research shows, like the kind of large data set type research and the more anecdotal experiences, that communities are way more able to fight off these, again, very asymmetric battles. You have multinational companies with government backing, with financiers from Wall Street, and you have a small community, and if they're lucky, like a few coalition partners. And in that asymmetry, organization is everything, because as we're honestly learning in the Strait of Hormuz right now in Iran, like if you are located, even in a really asymmetric battle, if you are located on a choke point of global capitalism, you can leverage that, and that can reverberate across supply chains, across scales. You can bring really powerful entities like the United States government to the negotiating table because you've said, we control this land. I'm not trying to equate Iran with frontline communities. I'm not trying to be too fast and loose here, but it actually does show us how choke points and global capitalism and what gives frontline communities power in their resistance. But maybe to just add one other piece to go to the other side of resistance, which is vision, which is what do we want for the future? I think so often, not in this panel, but in general, when people talk about anti-mining resistance or anti-extraction, it's all about the anti. But all of these movements have powerful visions for a different type of world, from their community level to their country or region, like in Latin America or Africa, to the globe. They are full of positive ideas for how to reorder the relationships between human and nature, for how to create an ecologically grounded economy, for how to actually get to the root causes of the climate crisis and have a more climate safe future, how to get rid of this corporatocracy, as Crystal said, and have actual democracy. So I think it's incumbent on folks in this room, and I mean to everyone, the audience, to also attend to what are the positive visions? What world do we want to build? And sure, there are tensions there. Like in the world I want to build, we do have to think about what are the natural resource inputs? What are the land inputs? Like, how do we work this through? But from a progressive position of democratic collectivity, of giving specific voice to the most marginalized, right? These are still thorny issues, no matter what type of social arrangement you have. But we are in a situation where extractivism is like off the rails, and it means that we can't just dispute one battle at a time. I think both Vivek and Crystal have offered, like, we need to think about the world otherwise that we want to build, and like what that would take, what strategies it would require, but also how we can bring people into a positive vision for a different future. And then we can have all sorts of interesting debates of, does tech fit into that? Do natural resources? How do we think about land? But we almost can't have some of those interesting conversations because we're just like battling the kind of gargantuan extractivist, all of these global corporations and governments that are really doing their bidding. So I think it's holding together resistance, hope, and positive visioning for strategy and policy that we need to think about simultaneously.
I'll jump in for a sec too. I think the question of enclosing futurity in a certain way, I think, is built into both the kind of infrastructure of the data center, but also the promise of AI at this moment. And I think it is really an important point, along with articulating the problem, and in that articulation, generating solutions to some degree, also having this larger push to not allow for a monopolization on the future in these terms, and an insistence on that. So both a kind of understanding of that smaller scale modes of resistance, but with this kind of like larger scale positive vision for the future that I think gets increasingly difficult to articulate by design almost, right? Both in terms of that kind of like content function of the generative AI boom, which is also then just part of a much like longer history of settler colonialism, as we've heard. And then, yeah, like actually articulating a future beyond that. That in some instances, as Thea said, involves technology, so to speak. Like I think, at least in my vision, that's the same, is that we have to make deliberative decisions about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and who we're doing it for. And when you start to ask those questions about the kind of current configuration, you get to poke a few holes into those promises that we're getting about what it is that these infrastructures are doing, and what it is even that to think about what it is that generative AI as a technology is even offering us as human beings in the first place, which, as I said in my little opening remarks, I think is fully an intention to resourcify intellectual capability. That sounds abstract maybe, and maybe also a bit conspiratorial, but Sam Altman has said as much. CEOs of these companies have said as much. So do you like paying your electricity bill? I don't really like doing that much, especially when it gets higher. I also don't want to have to be paying for critical thinking. And so the future that's being offered to us on these terms is almost making that seem inevitable. And that isn't the case. We can build our own future. And I think that needs to be insisted pretty firmly and consistently, as we're also articulating those kind of like more local grounded struggles.
If I can just jump in to take off on Thea's question, which I know this is a great conversation to have on tax day. In terms of what we want to see, what we're finding here locally, and this is everywhere, right? Like our local governments, our local municipal governments are cash strapped, and they're chasing whatever they can find to keep these cities going. And they're not very creative about it. And the focus of our attention is usually our elected officials. But I think we really need to recognize that there are two halves of government. One is the elected side, and one is the administrative and bureaucratic side. And the administrative and bureaucratic side is the side of our local government that take general directions from our elected officials and translate those into very specific projects. And that's really, I feel like that's where we as community members can really intervene in going to commission meetings, go to planning and zoning commission meetings, go to economic development team meeting, commission meetings, and really intervene there in what we want our vision for our communities to look like. Because yes, we can meet with our electeds. Yes, we can go to city council meetings, and we should speak in public comments there. And also there's this whole other side that people don't see, where the solutions are really developed. And so if no matter how you want to phrase economic development, right, whether you don't want economic development at all, whether you want to go to a degrowth model, whether you want to just distribute resources and wealth more equitably within your community, it has to happen there.
Thank you all. And I want to actually jump back into something that Vivek was talking about, and because I think it brings together a lot of the things that everyone has been kind of bringing here. You mentioned that for the No Desert Data Center Coalition, it's never been a NIMBY narrative, right? And not my backyard narrative. And that actually hasn't been the narrative that's been the most galvanizing for people in Tucson. So on the one hand, people are coming out around the practical questions of affordability and utility costs. But on the other hand, you've presented data centers as part of an infrastructure of what you are calling the cruelty industry. So I wonder if we can talk about, and this is for all of us, if we can talk about how the data center fight has been an opportunity for political education. So what kinds of conversations went for you, Vivek, went into the coalition's choice to emphasize, as you put on your website, the intersection of many causes, including public health, water scarcity, demilitarization, immigrant justice, tribal sovereignty, rather than, say, the singular cause of Project Blue. And I think that this work of political education, I see it in what Honor the Earth is doing as well. And of course, for the scholars on the panel, I'm sure you have much to say about that.
Full credit here in Tucson to members of our Native Nations Working Group who have led an effort to put together a winter school that really galvanized a lot of the attention we were getting after the data center win, and put together an amazing curriculum that related the data center fight to settler colonialism and framed like data centers and other modern extractive industries as a sort of resettlement, and really got into, and these were really well attended sessions. They did them once every 2 weeks. The last one just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago, and every session had 20, 30 people, community members gathering and talking and meeting with each other. And it's been really exciting just to see the level of engagement and connections that people are making outside just the data center fight to other things as well.
I'll jump in quickly. Just two things that I know for us has been big is know your audience. I mean, it's just organizing 101 is meet your audience where they are. And like, sometimes the issue is jobs. Sometimes the issue is like water impacts. Sometimes the issue is like NDAs and not having consent in a community. Sometimes it's about local control. And so it's just like, you have to be able to meet your audience where you are, which means like we become all things, right? Which is like both heavy work and also absolutely necessary. And that's just what it is. That's just the fight that we're in. The other thing that I'll say is like at Honor the Earth, we almost never talk about any of the AI infrastructure singularly. We always make sure we're connecting the dots with every conversation we have. So every time we speak, any one of us on my team, I could plug them in here and they would be just as effective, if not more. And they would talk about data centers and AI and the impacts of AI, cognitive decline. They would talk about critical minerals mining. They talk about nuclear, expansion of coal, revitalizing the coal. Like we would talk about all that, surveillance. They would be talking about militarism, all of it. And we have to always connect the dots. We can almost never, ever singularly talk about just hyperscale data centers, because then we're missing the point. And we're actually setting ourselves up to not effectively fight it. And so for us, those are like the two things that we've found useful in the work and that it's been successful.
Can I just add one point here on this question? And I really just love the framing, both of Vivek and Crystal, thinking about connecting the dots and thinking about intersecting struggles and intersecting harms. And maybe just a different angle on this coming from my work on how do we reduce the mining and extractivism associated with energy transition technologies. And a lot of the time, including some of our conversation, it very much focuses on the front lines of mining, how communities can resist or how local governments can regulate better, respect rights, etc. But what we have learned throughout this call is it's not what's happening in the locality that is driving that resource extraction or that data center. Like those decisions are made elsewhere, and there are entire supply chains of materials and finance that undergird that. And the reason I bring that all in is that I love Crystal's term of connecting the dots, which is a phrase I use myself often because I think it's a good visual metaphor for how we can connect our struggles, but also how we can change our perspective on who is part of a struggle in the first place. And one of the coolest pieces of research that I've been involved in at the Climate and Community Institute, we did a big report called More Mobility, Less Mining. And one of the things that we found is that you can really expand like people's access, working class people's access to clean mobility, to electric buses, to walkability, to e-bikes, to whatever it is so that they can get to where they need to go. And if you focus on that rather than how many electric Hummers, how many Teslas can we produce, we dramatically reduce how much mining is necessary. And we show this quantitatively very clearly. And so what I'm getting at, because I love Crystal's point of like, we have to see who's in the room and speak in ways that meet their interests and needs. And so when I'm talking to folks about why we need more community and public transit options, I know in the back of my head that means less mining, but I don't necessarily have to say that. I can say you, working class community, like deserve clean mobility to get to work. You deserve housing access. You deserve all of these collective goods and shared goods and public goods that we should have. And if I have a moment to sneak in, and by the way, that will help frontlines around the world because we need less mining when we consume collectively in shared and public ways than when we consume in these privatized, unequal ways. That's a win for me to make that point. But for me, I don't care what brings people into the room or like what speaks to their concerns because we can always connect those dots, right? And so I think as much on the supply chains I work on, as much as I want to lift up and focus on resistance at the mine site, in the extractive zone, at the front lines, also communities fighting for better mobility, better housing, public goods at the other end of the supply chain are part of reducing extractivism. And that can look different, that can be named different ways, but when we zoom out to the whole supply chain, we see a labor struggle here, a community struggle there, a frontline struggle in the third place, and they are connected materially, ideologically, in all sorts of ways in our kind of global capitalism. And so seeing those connections, I think, just empowers all of our movements to fight for a broader future that includes all of those nodes and those dots.
I'll add one tiny thing, which is I think, yeah, those are all really great points in that to some degree they point to a question of tactics, but I think more broadly than that, I think they also show us that the types of things that we're speaking about today, whether it's the pipeline or the data center, these infrastructures do have a concentration and uneven distribution of cost and benefits in particular ways that all of those points are true. They're not just, oh, we're only focusing on this one group for the sake of a certain kind of political strategy, but actually articulating the problem that is a problem. And I think one of the interesting things about the generative AI / data center conundrum is just that it seems such sort of like a useless infrastructure when you actually think about human needs of the planet and so on. And so that is another reason why it's drawn my attention as a kind of flashpoint for the types of intersectional struggles that we're speaking about. It's easier to actually, I think, organize on those terms and bring into view and connect those dots around a data center, even though those dots are actually quite similar to a pipeline, in that it is a certain kind of consciousness raising that's putting pressure on a problem that's really exacerbated in our recent history.
We're going to go to questions from the audience, but before we do, I want to turn back around to look at the data center frontier from an angle that's come up, but we haven't really fleshed out really as a group, at least. And it is really a question of connecting the dots. So like we've discussed in some ways the role of the AI data centers in what Vivek has been calling the cruelty industry of US border and deportation regime. But in the past few months, we've also seen them become flashpoints in the US and Israel's war with Iran. So a few months ago, Iranian forces targeted multiple data centers owned by major US firms in the UAE and Bahrain. And the US or Israel, I'm not sure, launched a missile at another state-run data center in Tehran, I think last month, yes. So last week, the World Economic Forum proposed defining these centers as critical infrastructure, comparable in importance to electricity grids, ports, or oil pipelines. And this, I think, has a lot of significance for all of our fights everywhere. And so to keep the question broad, what does this kind of what is the geopolitical significance of the data center expansion, and how can we read the current laterally across what's happening in this country and in the imperialist wars in the Middle East?
I'll take a first stab at that, and then I'd love to hear what my co-panelists have to say. So you've already laid out that for the first time in world history, data centers are like targeted assets in a geopolitical and geoeconomic conflict. And that is just a new page of history that we've turned. And so I think that underscores their strategic importance from a capitalist perspective. And so the fact that Iranian forces would target, right, a data center speaks to like the way that data centers have become key to capitalist technology writ large. And so they have that strategic value. But maybe I want to take this from two other angles, and then I want to get back quickly to your critical infrastructure piece, because I think that's very important. That naming of critical infrastructure has a lot of implications that are concerning and we need to think about. Real quick, there's a few other supply chain impacts, both on the material end and the financial end, that connect what's happening, the illegal war of aggression on Iran and Lebanon, to these data center fights here, wherever here is that we're sitting. One is that a couple of key inputs come out of the Strait of Hormuz or come out of the Gulf area that are inputs both to the, quote, digital transition, so the data center AI stuff, and the energy transition. So I'm looking at aluminum, for example. A lot of aluminum passes through that strait. There's a lot of use of aluminum in the hardware build out of a data center, but also the hardware build out of energy systems. Sulfur, something we may not think very much about, but sulfur is key, and sulfuric acid in processing minerals, especially copper. We already have a lot of pressure on copper supply at this moment due to just deposits that are aging out. And also we've seen a lot of resistance against copper mining. So for various reasons. And so this throws a kind of another little wrench in the workings of extractive capitalism to have the sulfur not as available. You have China doing export bans on their sulfuric acid. So there's a lot of reverberations. And then we can go to finance. We know that sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf region have been really important investors in AI and data centers. And so they're grappling with financial crisis at this moment due to the impact of the war on their finances. And so we'll see if that financing dries up, how different priorities work out. But I want to name one other piece about critical minerals and critical infrastructure, because I think I would be remiss to not note the imperialism and bellicosity that underlies those very definitions in their history and in their enactment today. So the term critical minerals comes from the interwar period in the United States and the lead up to World War II. That's when the U.S. government first started saying there are critical materials for wartime mobilization. So the list of what a critical mineral is that Crystal just gave us some interesting updates on relates to war, always has related to war, and to this day is linked to the perception of national security on the part of the U.S. state. I'll name one other quick thing on that and then just go to critical infrastructure briefly. Also to just connect dots to the relationship between war, but also genocide and internal forms of imperialism, colonialism, that the law that governs mining on federal land, and when we hear federal land, we can translate that as stolen land, right? Like we know where federal land came from in the Western U.S. That law is from 1872. A moment of brutal genocide and dispossession of indigenous peoples across the continent. And that law, the General Mining Act of 1872, is still the law that we use to govern mining in federal lands, and why you can literally put a stake in the ground like it's the Wild West movie and start a mining process that way, because we have not broken out of colonial legal frameworks and then the imperial and wartime legal frameworks that I just mentioned. Last thing, we've seen really concerning stuff. Crystal, who's done all the anti-pipeline stuff, is very aware of this, but these state-level pieces of legislation around critical infrastructure, it can sound good. Like, I agree. Like, our energy systems, our sanitation systems, our water systems are critical from my perspective. But that's not what they mean. What they mean is this investment is really important, and we have a state capital alliance to protect this physical asset against any type of protests, and all the critical infrastructure bills in Republican-controlled state houses tended to come after major anti-pipeline or other types of protest movements. And what they do is they escalate the legal retaliation and risk that activists face when they engage in a protest against something that's been named as critical, whether infrastructure or mineral. This is a legal playbook that we also see circulating globally in different governments, and a lot of governmental repression attends to extractive sectors, which are, by the way, the most violent in the world world in terms of the death of land defenders every year. So just to connect a few dots, but also bring in our histories, which I think illuminate the present quite a bit.
Just plus to all of that, I don't know if there's much more I can say. That was very well articulated. The only things I would add is just really emphasizing critical infrastructure and what that means for movement, right? It means that we are going to be repressed that much more. It means that when we go to resist, then we face that much more harsher repercussions. And folks like myself, I've already been slapped with the RICO Act, like for pipeline organizing. It means like we're going to see a lot more of that coming up in the future as we continue to resist these data centers, right? I think it also, just speaking to like critical minerals and like deeming this critical infrastructure, I think that just makes me want to double down more on like how we fight this. Like right now we're playing whack-a-mole. You know what I mean? Like we are. They're popping up left and right, all of these things, the mine, the nuclear, the power source, the data center itself, all of this is popping up. We're playing whack-a-mole. We're hitting these as much as we can. But again, we have to go back to the infrastructure and the systems that allow these to happen. And so that does move us into this political realm on the federal level. And I think like we can really look to the nuclear movement back in like the 80s, right? For all of the ground that they were able to gain and all of the protections they were able to put in place. Don't get me wrong, a lot of that has since been dismantled literally within the last few months. But just to say that is possible. And so I think there's a lot that we can look to actually create a roadmap for ourselves going forward and all the lessons that we've learned since then. The last thing I'll say is just looking at the fact that we're basically pawns in this like techno-feudal war that's happening, right? So insert the language around techno-feudalism, techno-colonialism. And I think that's what we're looking at is like, we're all just pawns in this. And really, they're using the language of sandboxes. And so what's happening is like the normalization of the use of generative AI through all of the systems that we use in our daily lives, cell phones, Google platforms, all of the organizations that use Google as our platform. Onto the Earth, actually, shout out our IT person, moved us away from Google. We're completely de-Googled. We are now only on Proton Mail. So it is possible to actually remove AI from our lives. We actually don't need it. It is not essential. But just to say, we are being used as sandboxes, which means we are being tested on, right? Actively through generative AI and the normalization of that across all of our daily activities, all of the platforms that we use in our daily lives. And all of that is just fueling towards war. At the end of the day, this is what the techno-feudal battle is for, is like reducing the loss of human life and having drone warfare, shifting over to that. And so I think that's the important thing here is like really diving into like militarism and the intersections there and making sure that we're connecting these grassroots fights on the local levels all the way to militarism and what we're seeing happen with genocide and now with Iran.
Not to dwell in the negative, but in the critical designation, along with like increasing the private and state like repressive protection of these infrastructures that comes along with that designation, it also changes the pathways for approval. And so the processes that we're already talking about being opaque only become more and potentially accelerated under those terms. It's basically a mirror story in the Canadian context, which I tend to be more familiar with also in these designations of critical infrastructure and critical minerals. And another point to make that's interesting and worth thinking about is even just this, when a privately owned infrastructure becomes deemed critical by a government. You're seeing a sort of interlinking of like state government level resources for protection and policing and so on and so forth for private infrastructure whose costs or whose benefits are ultimately in those private hands. The other point is about pawns. Nobody wants to be a pawn, but I think it's useful language, and you might not think you are. But if you actually look at just the concentration of wealth that's happening and the transfer of wealth that Vivek mentioned very briefly, but maybe we could return to, this is like historically unprecedented in a certain degree. This is really worth emphasizing, I think, that those of us who maybe are economically comfortable are also not at this scale of like wealth transfer that's happening. And that's really worth putting pressure on and identifying who it is that's actually benefiting from this. Yes, these infrastructures are fueling war, but what is the war for?
Just a really quick anecdote that really exemplifies what Crystal and Jordan just brought up in really absurd terms. Our friends in Texas were fighting a giant data center there, I forget the acreage, but it's anywhere between 11 and 17 gigawatts for, I think, a Palantir data center. They put in public records requests and they're constantly denied based on national security. We're talking about private privately owned land, not even federally controlled land.
Not surprising, but revolting. We're bringing Becca back on because we're reaching that stage in the event where we bring in voices from the audience. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and for your amazing comments and questions in the chat. I want to turn it over to Becca to offer some questions from our audience.
And
Thanks,
before we do
Steve.
that, can I say something really quick that there's the energy use side of this. When we fought back the data center here, a lot of what we won us with our argument was just the direct water use on site, right? But when these data center developers move over to air-cooled facilities, what they're doing for that same amount of computing power, they require more energy essentially for air conditioning. And that energy use implicates a lot of water, especially when we're talking about fracked gas energy. So we're talking about millions of gallons of water in someone else's community to frack the gas, leaving it unusable and ruining the land there. And then more water at the actual point of generation. So even though they may not be using water on site, the water doesn't just go away in use. Thanks.
Thank you, Vivek. We're running short on time, so I'm going to consolidate a bunch of questions and y'all can decide what to tackle. There's a cluster of questions asking us to get concrete about what these systems are and how they actually operate. So everything from heat and noise and waste, and how do these things make money? How do data centers make money? And what is AI doing that generates profit? So maybe you can speak either to the material impacts that we haven't addressed, or to the economic bubble that we might anticipate popping, and then communities and the rest of us in our broader economy paying the price. The second set of questions is around strategy, how people can plug into this work, and how local fights scale, and also how to build power without getting co-opted. So folks were asking about building coalitions, including across labor or Amazon workers or what have you, and how are folks navigating the tensions between cross-movement, alignment, and partial wins, and community benefit agreements or other forms of sort of potential co-optation. Yeah. Whatever you want to speak to out of that grab bag, have at it.
I could start with the question about how they operate, which is to say this is definitely not, internally operating is definitely not in my realm of expertise, but it's worth saying that it's electricity as the main input, and a lot of heat is generated by the actual equipment inside the data centers that then requires intensive cooling. And so between those two sorts of inputs, you can see how this then becomes a kind of massive resource suck in those two forms. And so that cooling can be done with water, that cooling can be done with air, and that electricity can be generated however electricity is generated. So just go and look at the sort of energy mix of your region of where electricity is being generated from, and you'll see how the data center is being fueled. So it's sometimes fossil fuels, it's sometimes hydroelectricity, it's sometimes nuclear, depending on where you actually are. But what you can say with certainty is that it's intensifying these regimes. It is the case, too, that I mentioned earlier, that I understand data centers as an energy infrastructure, because often the two are jointly bound in a way that you can't really disentangle them. And by that, one of the things that I'm interested in about this data center boom is how data centers are actually generating their own power plants or using their own stores of extraction. For example, this proposed data center in northern Alberta called Wonder Valley, proposed by Kevin O'Leary's investment company, O'Leary Ventures, which is proposed to be built on, I think it's 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas to fuel the largest data center that would exist in the world to date. And so this kind of melding of energy and data is leading to this intensification of kind of resources. What happens in those microprocessors and all those sorts of things starts to get a bit beyond my expertise. But there are lots of really interesting work in media and communication studies on heat and these sorts of even let's call them bodily and affective registers of how data centers operate. And so I'll throw a few of those into the chat. What were the other questions? How they make money? Do they make that much money? I'm actually not totally sure. I don't think they make that much money, but it's really a rentier economy in that they are renting out server space in these data centers, and that is where the money is happening. A lot of this is not clear yet as to will this even turn a profit. AI is not making money right now. Notoriously, all of the headlines are saying, hey, when is this going to make money? There's so much money being invested into it. That, I think, aside from the conversations we're having about more like material and end uses of the data for surveillance and the cruelty industry or cruelty regime, yeah, the financial side it's entirely speculative at this point, and it's not clear. And in fact, I think when people say the bubble will burst, that's more what they're talking about is the financial side. Yeah, I'll stop there. And I'll throw some articles in the chat that might be interesting.
Thank you, Jordan.
I'll just pick up on that financial piece quickly, the kind of bust piece. Is that okay, Becca? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay, I'll be briefer than anyone else because the other folks on the call are the real data center AI type experts. But I do want to get at this issue of is this bubble going to burst? Are we about to see a bust? And I'm not going to predict it, but I think we should think clearly and rigorously on what's on the other side of a bust or bubble bursting in capitalist markets and what that means. Because I think sometimes there's a bit of wish casting, we might hold it, like the sector is going to just implode on itself because there isn't a clear business model, because there's all this interlocking ownership and interlocking liability and interlocking financial structures that create obvious systemic risk for sure, but systemic risk doesn't lead to liberation. Let me just put it really quickly that way. Like that is not how struggles that have been world shaping in the past. They didn't sit and wait like the capitalists are going to just enter a crisis among themselves and like they'll do the work for us. I don't think anyone really thinks that, but we sometimes get to the edge of that wishful thinking. And so just to add really briefly, boom and bust cycles are endemic to the way that capitalism operates. And on the other side of a bust or a bubble bursting, in financialized terms, if we want to think about it that way, is usually consolidation and concentration of profit, right? Because what happens is the strongest survive. It's like very Darwinian, if we want to use that terminology, that what happened after the oil and gas bust in 2014? Did we stop using oil and gas? No, we got major consolidation of shale fracking and bigger companies. We got the whole US emerging as like this major LNG exporter to the world. What happened after the dot-com bubble burst in the 90s? Did we stop using the internet? No, we got major consolidation of big tech, of platform capitalism. And so the strongest, quote unquote, survive these moments. They get more powerful. And so that we have to plan ahead for what the bust will mean. It probably won't mean the end of this industry. It will mean its reorganization and financial concentration. And then the last thing to say that in those moments of bust or of some investments not working out, let's say, we have real harm. These are physical investments. When they are just left because maybe an investor couldn't continue to shore up the money or there was investor disinterest, those are physical pieces of infrastructure, or in the case of mining, like half done exploration that are just left. And then the community is left with those harms that are not remediated, that are not rehabilitated. And so we also should be aware that an investor simply disappearing is not justice. What is justice is repair, is rehabilitation, is manufacturer or mining company responsibility for shouldering that cleanup, because there's a lot of harm. And when we talk about e-waste, when we talk about electronic waste or an open mine pit, those continue to contaminate whether or not the mining or the data is flowing. And so we need to think again on what's on the other end of these moments of an asset not panning out or like a bubble bursting.
Thank you for that, Thea. I think we probably have to wind down from there, but I just want to name that you set us up for acknowledging a crisis-opportunity here. I have, frankly, never seen in 30 plus years of organizing such momentum and energy coalescing around infrastructure fights, and that it's coming from all corners and all backgrounds. And so I think that in terms of building the durable solidarities and movement infrastructure that's required to see us past disaster capitalism, those ingredients are there. And I want to thank all of our panelists for all of the work that you're doing to make that possible. And so I want to also tell everybody that we will be sharing out the recording as well as the chat. So I know there are a lot of really great resources there. I appreciate you, Jordan Kinder, Crystal Tubles, Thea Rio Francos, and Vivek Bathan. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing, Vivek especially. Our struggles have hills and valleys, and I do hope that you'll keep us in the loop, because we all want, I'm going to speak for myself at least, would love to do whatever we can to support your struggle. And thank you all of us for joining us. If today's event resonated, we would love to hear from you. A feedback form just popped up. And to stay in the loop about upcoming events and resources and updates, you can subscribe to our email list at thenaturalhistorymuseum.org. If you haven't already discerned, if you don't know us, we are not your mama's Natural History Museum. We're a traveling and online museum for the movement. So do sign up for the next event in the series. And I also want to offer thanks again to our sponsors, the Henry Luce Foundation and For Culture, and to our behind-the-scenes production team, Andrea Rollifson from the Natural History Museum and Cal Moody from Alluvium Gatherings for helping things run smoothly behind the scenes. We are going to close with the full recording of Which Side Are You On, performed by Sun Sing Collective, a group of musicians across Virginia who use song and performance to inspire resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure. Thanks again, and see you next time.
Today we face our future, and there ain't no neutral ground. You're either wide awake or fast asleep. Climate crisis is going down. Which side are you on now? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? In the Capitol, the governor's boss is law. The lobbyists line their pockets while they serve corruption's call. Now the halls of power want right to work, their union busting lies. We need working folks in solidarity and our labor organized. Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? The trees up in the mountains, brave resistors make their stand to defend our planet's future, protect our water, air, and land. The judge lays down fines, $500 every day, while the richest nation in history, politicians look away. Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Oh, now, which side are you on? Now waters rise, smoke fill the skies. There's a choice we gotta make. A just transition and a Green New Deal is the only road to take. Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which Today we face our future, and there ain't no neutral ground. You're either wide awake or fast asleep. Climate crisis is going down. Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? In the Capitol, the governor's boss is the law. The lobbyists line their pockets while they serve corruption's call. Now the halls of power won't right to work. Their union busting lies. We need working folks in solidarity and our labor organized. Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? The trees up in the mountains, brave resistors make their stand to defend our planet's future, protect our water, air, and land. The judge lays down fines, $500 every day, while the richest nation in history, politicians look away. Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? Which side are you on now? Which side are you on? There's a choice we gotta make. A just transition and a Green New Deal is the only road to take. Which side are